Architecture of Submersion proposes setting up of a brief for the spatial organization of the Gulf of Mexico and its coastal areas. Within the time frame of the next 80 years, the slow violence of climate change will inevitably reshape the borders of the United States and Mexico, and with it, current socio-economic relations of the whole region. The process of acclimatization establishes an opportunity to rethink the existing jurisdictions and institutional structures of governance, yet also reveals challenges in territorial management. Acknowledging the coast of the Gulf as a zone of particular interest in transition, the brief is divided into 3 phases of action. Phase 1. Setting out a methodology to assess the existing conditions and resource distribution. Phase 2. Proposing a series of spatial tactics to mitigate the impact of sea level rise on the urban and natural environment. And Phase 3. Creating a platform advocating for spatial responsibility. To understand the urgency for spatial organization of the Gulf of Mexico coastline, it is important to first analyze the existing practices and the institutional approach towards implementation of transitioning systems. For this study, I have focused on the integration of renewable energy into the technological fabric of the United States. For centuries, the oil, gas, and coal industries have led the globalization front over multiple scales. Long centuries of expansion of the meticulous architecture of fossil fuels has embedded itself in the texture of the geoeconomics and dictated the politics of the territories. However, as the world is moving from an energy system of regional scarcity to the one of potential abundance, there is an increase in independence from limited geographical access of generated power. The Solutions Project is one of the platforms which has produced a series of documents proposing localized energy sources for each state in 2050. Filled with the propositional data, the report does not exercise any sort of physical application. I decided to calculate the numbers myself and apply them on the state of Louisiana. Accounting for the full-scale transition towards renewables, the Solutions Project predicts to require 37% less of today's amount of energy by the year 2050. Out of 100, it suggests that 60% would be supplied by the offshore wind turbines in the Gulf of Mexico. Projecting the state borders across the Gulf, I have estimated 150,000 square kilometers of sea available for the integration of green energy infrastructure. After assessing the variations of the layouts for the offshore turbines based on their size, the optimized planning shown in purple was applied as a grid in the specified area of the Gulf. Calculating the potentialities for the state with the most advanced technologies, the reality is very far away from the Solutions Project's estimates. 150,000 square kilometers of sea can barely provide 5% of total energy, and this positioning disregards the existing cargo routes, restricted areas, and oil platforms. This case study is only beginning to reveal the inevitable crisis the transition might implicate on the interior and exterior of the Gulf when single systems are taken in isolation. The Gulf of Mexico carries politically charged strategical importance for the United States, Mexico, and Cuba. It embodies the complexity of economic dependence on fossil fuels, fishing, and transportation. For over decades, thousands of miles of constructed pipelines have shaped the coastal areas, bringing the destruction of fragile ecosystems and contributing to the erosion of the land. The excessive extraction of oil over the previous decades in total have scarred the seabed more than 23,000 oil drills. They contribute to the slow violence in the Gulf, with oil spills of small and large scales happening regularly. This map shows leases, maritime zones, danger zones, dump sites. The toxicity level not shown on this map can be witnessed through some of the satellite imagery. Annually, the Mississippi River collects roughly 10,000 pounds of fertilizer and raw sewage pollution from 31 states. This creates the dead zone, which is an area in the Gulf of Mexico where life cannot exist because there's too little oxygen in the water. The accumulation of these environmental threats are already starting to affect the livelihood of the fishermen. The Yucatan area, rich with its famous Mayan red octopus, is seeing a sudden decrease in species population due to the climate change, forcing the locals to construct artificial farms to maintain the industry. Yet the biggest threat for the marine environment to be identified and acknowledged as soon as possible is the consequence of the sea level rise and the effect it will carry out on the built and natural environment. By the end of the century, the sea level rise is predicted to reach 3 meters. Under the risk of submerging, my site is the zone defined by the risk assessment maps of flooding, elevation, and population density of today. Within this strip, 56 million people inhabit industrialized cities and small settlements economically and socially dependent on the resources in the Gulf. 5,000 kilometers of the existing coastal infrastructure in the following 80 years will become part of the Gulf, and the architecture of its submersion is what the brief attempts to design. For the site sitting on the conjunction of two phenomena of climate change and toxicity, I begin my phase 2 offering a methodology for creation of strategic plan. Galveston is one of the many barrier islands that sits on the forefront. Within the following 80 years, the community of over 50,000 will be forced to relocate due to the sea level rise. Despite their attempts to construct seawalls on the south, west, and east coastlines as illustrated, the entire island will inevitably become uninhabitable. Analyzing the density population statistics as well as the official datasets of the state of Texas, I have mapped the districts and the infrastructure existing or currently under construction. The majority of the high-rise buildings are located within this circle and should be considered the priority in the proposed strategic planning. These include several different building typologies serving civil programs, public and residential housings, each with a necessity for an exclusive response towards the 3-meter sea level rise. In order to mitigate the effect of the sea on the built environment and vice versa, I have developed this diagram. It draws the spectrum of toxicity, which catalogues and further regulates the time frame and tactics for safe and efficient deconstruction of the coast. First line responds to buildings as objects, second is individual materials, and the third illustrates other infrastructural systems. Purple meaning high level of hazard to green, which is low. Using Geographic Information System, this spectrum can be applied on any city to identify buildings which carry potential hazards and must undertake urgent action. These tactics are divided into 3. Tactic 1. Decommissioning. Nuclear power plant is the most hazardous typology of a building I have identified on the spectrum. In the first stage, the highly toxic waste needs to be taken out and safely stored in specially allocated sites. The reactors must be allowed up to 50 years to decontaminate, and during this time the surrounding structures can be disassembled and recycled. The entire process takes up to 60 years to ensure that there is no risk of radioactive elements entering the marine environment. As of today, there are 3 nuclear power plants situated on the coast of Gulf of Mexico. Tactic 2. Partial deconstruction. An example of this strategy can be applied on the cemeteries where only some elements threaten the health of the ecosystem in the case of submersion. Formaldehyde is a chemical used in the embalming process. It is considered a dangerous pollutant and influences the nervous systems of living beings. Either owned privately or by the state, cemeteries can take up to 25 years to deconstruct due to jurisdictional complexity. Tactic 3. Dismantling. Although the majority of the small-scale housings will not be able to withstand the climate change, I propose a strategy for multi-story buildings. Analyzing each material within the structure, heating, ventilation, and plumbing systems, it is possible to minimize the hazardous materials' contact with salt water. By dismantling the ground floor utilities and ensuring the stability of the structure, one can imagine the opportunities presented within this architecture of submersion. Altogether, the system establishes a methodology of feasible and time-framed response to the impact of sea level rise. Applied on sites, it can become an algorithmic process informing the general public and the local governmental institutions on the requirements for each individual structural dwelling. The system can regulate the market value of the newly constructed houses based on their locations, risks, and life expectancy. Proposing a shift in the paradigm of coastal management design, the brief urges to rethink the existing practice of climate change delay. The project recognizes the shoreline as a moving battlefront that creates inland and seaward theaters of operation. Strategic Redevelopment Drawing of Galveston deploys an inventory of zoning devices that act on both fronts. These are firstly tools for retention, temporary flood-preventing hoardings for the period of city deconstruction, cleanup barriers assuaging the dangers of toxic material spread, living shoreline sills, for instance oyster reefs, that act as natural breakwaters allowing to further implement tools for restoration, which include natural infrastructure such as wetlands, forests, dunes, mangroves, as well as artificial, creation of coral reefs utilizing dismantled building materials. Applied on different sites, this methodology will reveal regional problematics but simultaneously create opportunities for alternative spatial organization. The expanding inventory of tactics and devices will be critical to developing a strategic Gulf-wide approach and assessing its results. In the following 80 years, the project proposes a series of institutional adjustments on territorial management and resource distribution. Dictated by the principles of toxicity awareness, current approach towards coastal administration temporarily abolishes the concept of state division. Similar to exclusive economic and spatial economic zones, it creates a unified sovereign front with authority over national environment policy and economic affairs. coordinating efforts by private landowners, partner organizations, and local, tribal, and federal governments to connect conservation activities on endangered lands. Subsequently, allowing for the zone of submersion identified in the brief to become a platform advocating for spatial responsibility.